Hello and welcome to the New Book of Daniel podcast. I'm turning the sound off on my phone so that nobody bothers me. My name is Daniel Bobinski, and I am here for your host for the next, I don't know how long it's going to do this podcast. Welcome to the show. We've got some interesting, fun things going on. As usual, I'll be looking at the news from a Patriot's perspective. Before I start, though, I wanted to remind you, in case you haven't seen it yet, we have these new Book of Daniel coffee mugs, which you can order. I will put a little link down in the show notes down below. And I've got my microphone way over here, and I'm just realizing you guys probably can't even hear me because I didn't set that up. Once again, this is Daniel Bobinski. Now you can hear me with the New Book of Daniel podcast. Make sure that you check out the link for these New Book of Daniel coffee mugs. And if you need a recipe for coffee, I got a great recipe. You put water through little ground up coffee beans and you get this delicious coffee. So if you buy a New Book of Daniel coffee mug, helps out the podcast a little bit, a couple of bucks, but they're kind of fun. And, you know, one of my favorite sayings on there, first of all, it says, first you're born, then you have choices, which is one of the things that I teach my clients. Because you hear this phrase, first you're born and then you pay taxes. Not true, because you can choose not to pay taxes. But what you have to realize is there's a consequence to every choice that you make. So if you don't pay taxes, chances are you'll end up in the federal pen. A friend of mine did that about 10 years ago, decided not to pay his taxes. Said, hey, don't do that, dude. He did it, ended up spending a year in a yellow jumpsuit, an orange jumpsuit. So my point being, though, is that first you're born, then you have choices, because that's where personal responsibility comes into play. And that's where our government comes into play. The whole concept of self-government means taking responsibility, making good choices. So that's a Danielism that I teach a lot of my clients. First you're born, and then you pay, and then you have choices. But then on this one, I actually, for a little bit of fun, I added the phrase, choose coffee. I personally do not measure my coffee consumption in cups. I measure it in pots. And so I'm drinking some coffee here. Hey, Patriot News. Patriot News. What's going on in the Patriot News world? Well, maybe you've heard of this guy named John Kerry. He attempted to run for president. He's commonly referred to as Lurch, because he kind of has that look. If you watch The Addams Family from way back when, if you're my age, you remember that show back before it was in reruns. Anyways, Kerry claimed last month that we have 9 years left to avert a climate crisis. He says, quote, the scientists told us 3 years ago that we had 12 years to avert the worst consequences of the climate crisis. We are now 3 years gone, so we have 9 years left. He said that on CBS this morning. So we'll be talking a little bit about climate crisis here and the reality of that. Going to spend a little time talking about that. I also want to talk about something that one of my colleagues over at Uncover DC talked about or wrote about, and that is homeschooling and the rise in homeschooling. And as a homeschooling family here, my wife and I homeschooled our daughter, my nephew, my niece, my other niece, and a neighbor, because in Idaho, that's perfectly legal to do. We homeschooled for, 14 years. And we had all learning styles, all ages. We had at one time age 4 to age 16 going on there, 17. And so we had a wide variety of opportunities about how do you teach when you have multiple children with multiple ages. If that's you, stick around. I'll be talking about that later on here in the show. And then I also wanted to talk about Mr. Fauci, because Mr. Fauci is, he's wrong about a lot of things. And he's wrong about this thing called herd immunity. So we're going to talk about that as well. All right. I gave you a little tease here. Mr. Kerry back last month said that we have 9 years left to avert a climate crisis. Oh, Mr. Kerry, he says here, and this is an article out of the what is this magazine here? Washington Post. Yeah, just our friends over there. The question of whether humans have contributed to climate change may still be a subject of debate in the political sphere. In other words, politicians still arguing. But then here's my catch that I love. But it's been a settled issue among climate scientists for years as to whether humans contribute to climate change. I got news for these climate scientists. Humans have been contributing to climate change since humans appeared on Earth. Ever since God formed Adam and Eve, right? There's been a climate impact. In 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a United Nations body. Now, they're very clear to underline that for us. It's a United Nations body, which means it's important, right? Because they always tell us the truth and they're always concerned about our best interest. So they say. They issued a report that the planet, which has already warmed 1 degree above pre-industrial levels, which is approximately 1850 to 1890, would warm another 1.5 degrees between 2030 and 2052 unless significant steps were taken to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. Yes. The 2015 Paris Climate Accord started back then. You know, Mr. Obama got us involved in that. Mr. Trump got us out of that. And wouldn't you know, even while the United States was out of the Paris Climate Accord, we reduced our carbon footprint by a lot, whereas China and India, who's still part of the Climate Accord in Paris, actually increased their carbon footprint. How come the Washington Post doesn't report on that? I'm just kind of curious. All this talk about increasing temperatures, blah, 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 blah. Let me also quote the New Yorker here recently. It says, global warming has been a public concern since only about 1990. Actually, it was 1998, but that's when the first political talks about it came about. Scientists had worked on it for a decade prior, but now we know that the oil companies had also been studying the impact of their products on the climate. But it wasn't James Hansen's congressional testimony in 1998 that brought the issue to the open. It was the Rio Earth Summit in 1992 that marked the first halting attempts at something like international negotiations to address it. 2050 has now emerged as the consensus target for many countries to go carbon neutral. That date won't mark the end of the climate crisis, but it's useful as a final deadline for the transition to a new economic and energy regime that respects the physical limits of the planet. So, 3 decades down, 3 to go. The New Yorker giving us a little bit of tension. Oh, gosh. Well, I got some news for these guys because there's a study that just came out a couple of days ago, and the headline is, it's official. Greenland hasn't warmed a bit since the year 2001. That's right, 20 years ago, Greenland stopped warming. A significant warming trend occurred in the late 20th century across Greenland, mirroring the warming that occurred in the early 20th century. But since 2001, the temperature trend across Greenland has stopped, and actually it's begun cooling. This isn't Daniel Bobinski telling you this. This is the study. Now I will link to this in the show notes after this thing is into replay here. I'm doing this live. It says a temperature pattern has been emerging in Greenland during the last few decades that does not align with the alarming proclamations of the catastrophic ice sheet melt for accelerated warming. I can't show it here. I will have to show it tomorrow. There is actually a graph, some places that I saw where the ocean warming actually started way back around 1600s or so, and it started to do this gradual warm, and then around about 1750 it started taking off a lot more. and it's pretty steady increase in global, I'm sorry, not global temperatures, global sea level, not temperature, sea level. Why has the sea level been rising? Not because of the global ice sheet melting, guarantee you that, because we have records of the graph here, and maybe I'll link to the graph down in the show notes. Remind me to do that. But the interesting kicker here is that 85%, this is the scientists' own data, 85% of man-made greenhouse gases have been emitted since after World War II. Get that. After World War II, we had this big flux of greenhouse gases, and yet there is no increase in the global sea levels. I mean, it's still been increasing, but it's increasing at the same rate. Tell us about this, Mr. Scientist. How can that be? Dubious CO2-induced Greenland warming. For some reason, they believe it is reasonable to assume CO2 has been driving the recent warming, even though CO2 has continued rising. Temperatures have flattened and cooled in this century. So I want to take you back a little bit in time to the year 2006, which would be 15 years ago, right? Ready for this? In The Guardian, the British, the Great Britain newspaper, The Guardian. Ready for the headline? 10 years to save the planet from mankind. The Stern report will tomorrow reveal that if governments do nothing, climate change will cost more than both world wars and render swaths of the planet uninhabitable. That was 2006. Of course, they'll say, of course, we started doing something. So, you know, we stopped it. I want to go back to when I was in school, like 40, 50 years ago, because, yeah, I'm actually 60 years old. But so when I was in junior high and high school, you know what the big talk was back then? The ozone hole. And the hole in the ozone is going to just burn up. We're going to burn up and we're not going to have survivability. Has anybody heard about the ozone hole lately? I'm going back to the 1970s. This is the ozone hole. Oh my gosh, we're all going to die. Stop. Ozone hole, it turns out, gets bigger, gets smaller, gets bigger, gets smaller. There's a pattern to it. It does this flex thing. And we're not going to die. I mean, everybody's going to die eventually, but not from the ozone hole. I'm going back to 2006 here. Amid such doomsday warnings, Britons could easily conclude that trading in on the 4x4, remembering to turn off lights, is merely whistling in the wind. It's about turning off your lights and see if it's just like nothing. All this climate change, turn off your lights, and all this little micromanagement of your life to save the planet. It's also important. Talk about plane tickets. This whole article is this long, drab article in The Guardian about how cars are going to be damaged. We're going to have all this damage from car exhaust and bus exhaust and blah, 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 airplane this and airplane that. Enough of it. The climate crisis, blah, 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 blah. All these pounds of... Here's one for NBC News. NBC News, 2006. Warming expert, only a decade left to act in time. A leading U.S. climate researcher said Wednesday the world has 10 years of opportunity to take decisive action on global warming to avert a catastrophe. Yeah, that was 2006. That was 15 years ago. I guess we've got our catastrophe. And now they're still saying it 15 years. It's like this moving window. They're always going to give us 15 years before the 10 years or 9 years before the climate's going to just destroy the whole world. And yet it doesn't. So you ready for this? Here's Google. Need directions is a headline. Just saw this today from The Right Scoop. Need directions? Google Maps will soon give you a climate change route when you use their GPS. Google will soon be pushing the phony climate change nonsense through its Maps app when you ask for directions. Google Maps will start directing drivers along routes estimated to generate the lowest carbon emissions based on traffic, slopes, and other factors, the company announced on Tuesday, which would be, this week. So Google Maps is going to say, here's the best climate route that you can take. Google, an Alphabet Inc. unit, said that the feature would launch later this year in the US and eventually reach other countries as part of its commitment to help combat climate change through its services. Unless users opt out, the default route will be eco-friendly, especially if comparable options take the same time. So they're going to give you the eco-friendly route. Google will offer choices and let users compare estimated emissions. Quote, what we are seeing is for around half of routes, we will be able to find an option that is more eco-friendly with minimal or no time cost trade-off. I will be interested to see how this looks. I really will. I would like to see what their rationale is for what constitutes an eco-friendly route. What are the other factors that they don't talk about? Slopes, going downhill. It's downhill. Go figure. All right. Let me shift my conversation to homeschooling. With last year, this little thing called this COVID-19 bug that went around and shut down the entire planet and the economies. And I'm sure that the cure was worse than the disease. Depression, people seeing therapists. I'm seeing people going nuts, going crazy because people aren't wearing masks. The psychological impact in our country and the whole world is indescribable. I have to tell you, I was looking at the news today as to what I was going to talk about on the podcast here. And I was just like, I can't believe all the insanity that's out there, all of the craziness. So my wife and I, we taught homeschool long before COVID came along, right? As I said at the beginning of the show, one of the things that we did was we started a speech and debate club for homeschooled teens. Because obviously most schools, most regular publics and private and charter schools will have a speech and debate club. So since my wife is well versed in debate and I've taught speech before, presentation skills and those kind of things, we're going to give a speech class and a debate class, and we taught these kids. There's a technique in in debate called spreading. And what it means is, so in a debate, you have, let's just take a very simple debate where you have a couple of chances. You get X number of minutes to make your case, and then X number of minutes to make your counter case, and then X number of minutes to rebut the counter case, and X number of minutes to rebut the counter of the counter case. And so it's this ability to address points. And if you don't, your point of contention, and if someone who's the opposition does not address your point, it's the equivalent of conceding the point. So if I get up there and I've got 5 minutes to talk, and I bring up 5 points in my discussion, and you get up next and you only cover 3 of my 5 points, you only rebut 3 of my 5, then when I get up next, I'll say, oh, my opponent never even addressed these 2 points that I made. He only addressed these 3. So he concedes them to me, and therefore I win that part of the debate. And that's how that works. It's called bad form, but some kids did it. We always taught against it. But some of the different clubs, they would practice and teach their kids to do what's called spreading. And they'd go out there, they'd present 8 or 9 different talking points in their allotted time. There's no way you can rebut 8 or 9 talking points. And it's called spreading so that you can't do it, and then you end up losing because you can't meet. So it's bad form. But here's what I see happening with the Marxists in our society as they throw critical race theory after us. Everything you look at now is racist, this, racist, that. And reparations this and reparations that and BLM this and Antifa that, and it's unbelievable how much they're just spreading all this stuff. They're throwing all this stuff at us, making it very difficult to address any of it, because it's like an avalanche of pure 100% unadulterated BS, and yet you have to deal with it. And so if you're smart, when your kids were taken out of school this last year because of the COVID dirty little thing, which has they're finding as 99.7% recovery rate. Hopefully you've realized, with all of the boys being able to compete with girls in sports, and all the critical race theory being taught even to kindergartners and preschoolers now, hopefully you have decided, if you've been homeschooling, to continue homeschooling. And I pray that you do. And I should say that if you're looking for some help in that, by the way, get a hold of me. You can find me on social media. Just go to any of the social media platforms except Twitter, because I'm no longer on Twitter. But like Facebook, the New Book of Daniel page, or Gab, or MeWe, just find me as New Book of Daniel. Send me a message and say, hey, I'd like to talk with your wife about homeschooling, because she's a genius when it comes to homeschooling. Both of us have spoken at homeschool conventions. She has actually written some stuff, some books on homeschooling and how to identify curriculum based on style. As a matter of fact, if you're interested, this is a little green book behind me right here. You can get that on Amazon as a Kindle book right now, and you can also buy it as a soft cover as well. But that's called Become a Student of Your Students. And my wife and I wrote that book, 6 years ago? And we submitted it to the Idaho Book Awards. It was selected as a top 10 nonfiction. So, it's not me telling you it's a good book. I'm a little biased. I'm the co-author of it. My wife and I wrote it, but it is an award-winning book. It's kind of funny. I laugh because my wife and I, it was the first book we wrote together. And I'd written several books before that and never won an award. I mean, I got bestseller, but I never won an award. And yet, so my wife's very first book, she gets an award. Pretty cool. But homeschooling is the way to go. Really, you can maintain your value system. You don't have to let your kids get infiltrated in their brains, filled with all this Marxist critical race theory garbage. I'm talking with parents on a regular basis, how they're losing their kids, and they can see their kids being lost. And I just want to say, why don't you pull them out and teach them at home? And they always say, well, I don't have the time or this. It's like, but you're losing your kids. You're literally letting your kids get sucked into the Marxist mindset, and they're buying into it. Is it worth it? I have to tell you, we did a one-income family for all this time, and it was very worth it. No, we couldn't go on all the fancy vacations. No, we couldn't buy all the fun things we wanted to. We were one-income family. My wife was teaching all the time, and I even jumped in to teach some classes. But the sacrifice is well worth it. And I strongly encourage everybody, if you can, count the cost. Take a look at what sacrifices need to be made. You'd be surprised what you can live without, and keep your kids' values secure. And what's also amazing about homeschooling is that you get to like your kids. You get to respect them and find out the cool personalities they've got, and you get to teach them. And if you're afraid of teaching, if there's a subject that you don't want to teach, that's what they have homeschool co-ops for. 1 day a week, my wife actually here, or in our house, we have a homeschool class where parents bring their kids, and my wife will teach. She teaches 4 different classes on 1 day of the week. I'll walk out of my office and I look into that den, and there's all these kids, and my wife's teaching a class on science, and she's teaching different sciences. She teaches a government class, and then she goes out on the next day to a next town over, and she teaches a couple classes at a co-op that meets at a church. And there's hundreds of kids that go to this co-op, and they get their science class or whatever class that you don't want to teach. There's some mom that wants to teach it. And they'll teach them at these co-ops. And so you get the assignments and the kids go home and they do their homework and they do their assignments and they send them in. Homeschooling families stick together. So you definitely want to look at this if you have the option to do so. So Larry Schweikert over at uncoverdc.com, which is where I do most of my writing. Other places as well, like Red State and New Book of Daniel podcast, and a big announcement coming up here soon. But Larry Schweikert did a piece on homeschooling at Uncover DC, and you might want to go read it. He's talking about these homeschool conventions. There's a group that does them called Great Homeschool Conventions. Now, I never spoke at one of those conventions. I usually spoke at the private conventions. But you can go to these homeschool conventions, and you can find curriculum that matches your child's learning style. And again, if you have any questions about that, get a hold of me. My wife and I will help you identify your children's learning style, so you can choose the best curriculum to do that. My wife charges a very small fee. She charges $20 to do that. Killer info though for that fee. It's not a lot, but she's going to take an hour or two to work with you to find out what your child is like and how you teach and help you choose the best curriculum. So they have these homeschool conventions, and you can go to them and you can find out about homeschooling and get your questions answered. You can find curriculum. There's lots of different booths there, people selling curriculum, and you find out what's going on. You get to network with other homeschoolers. So they had this homeschooling conventions. Larry's talking about being at one because they were all a lot canceled last year. They were quote unquote virtual conventions. Really, they didn't cancel homeschool. They just canceled these in face-to-face, but they're coming back this year. And he says the year 2020, or as it's known in China, the year of the virus, caused a new wave in homeschooling. And hopefully you were part of that. Some of it's predictable, normal growth. Parents have become increasingly fed up with transgender athletes in their kids' locker rooms, anti-Americanism and nation hate being taught in the classroom, and a never-ending torrent of race guilt. The 1619 Project is horrible. So parents started homeschooling. Believe it or not, I think they were I think homeschooling went up like 40%, 20%. It's amazing. I'm looking at the article and I didn't highlight it, so I'm kicking myself right now. But very strong increase in homeschoolers and people who want to continue to homeschool. So you can go to these conventions. They got them in just about every state. If you're wondering how to find it, go to any search engine. I recommend DuckDuckGo, and just punch in homeschooling convention and then type in the name of your state. And some states actually have more than one convention. And you can go to, and if you live near a border, check the homeschooling convention for the next state over, because maybe there's a homeschool convention right on the border. For example, Boise is in southwest Idaho. There's a convention between here and the Oregon border. And so if somebody's over in, say, Pocatello or Idaho Falls, the east side of the state, they might want to take a look at the homeschooling convention in Wyoming or the one in Montana. If they're in northern Idaho, they might want to go to a homeschooling convention in Spokane, Washington, instead of coming down to Idaho. But we get a lot of people from Oregon that come to the Idaho convention because it's only a half an hour drive from where that convention is held to the Oregon border. And I've spoken at that convention, I think, 4 times, the Idaho convention. And we've had people there from as far away as Arizona and New Mexico. They come to the convention because they hear what's there and they want to learn. So you can learn that way. These conventions are a very, very cool place to meet up with and network with people who are doing homeschool. The guy who does all the research on homeschool actually lives over in Oregon, about an hour and a half from me here. And it's amazing, the stats of how much better students who are homeschooled do on general tests. The government schools, the institutional government / public schools will never tell you that. They will poo-poo homeschooling. They'll throw all sorts of arguments at you, such as, What about socialization? Oh my gosh, socialization. We need to have that. So, you know what? As a homeschooled kid, it's not just sitting in your home. There is so much interaction. We had our daughter going to gymnastics class. Our daughter took violin lessons. We had her going to taekwondo. There's nobody. The cool thing about it is that homeschooled kids interact with people of all ages very, very well. When you get a public school kid, they tend to talk with kids only their own age because that's the environment that they're in every day. And the social strata is of, well, okay, if you're in, say, 5th grade, well, then a 3rd grader's got to be just as he doesn't know much, or a 7th grader or a 9th grader, oh my gosh, he knows so much more. And you don't talk to these because of those differences. In homeschool, that doesn't exist at all. You get a 5th grader in the homeschooling realm whose sister is in 3rd grade, whose older brother might be in 9th grade. They're still talking and they're learning on some of the same topics, different levels of learning, but they're getting the same topics and sometimes the same kind of fun field trips. And they talk to adults very, very well. It's amazing. I've known kids who were raised up until age 4 or 5, and they all very outgoing and get along and they love everybody. And then you got the homeschooled kid that stays homeschooled, and then the other kids go into public school. And it doesn't take but about 4 or 5 years, and those public school kids that you go to a party, they don't talk to adults anymore. It's all 1-syllable answers. I'm not saying this is across the board. I'm not saying it's everyone, but by and large, you see these public school kids start to shut down. And they don't engage as much with other people except the folks in their own little sphere. Whereas the homeschool kid is talking with everybody because that's normal. That's normal for a homeschool kid. So when you hear this argument against socialization, it is a bunch of malarkey. It is pure 100% not true. Unless because you choose your homeschool. Nobody's telling you as a homeschooling parent that you have to keep your kid home all day long and not interact with anybody. That's not what homeschool means. And it's amazing how you take some kid out to the grocery store. I used to love taking my daughter to the store when she was learning about money and learning how to do math calculations. And then we'd say, okay, so I take her to the store, we're going to buy something, and I'd give her the cash, and I'd say, okay, so here's the price on the item. Let's calculate the tax. We figure it all out. She's sitting on the floor and she's doing the math as what the tax is going to be, and we're having fun. She's learning. We're getting some errands done, and somebody walks by and says, "How come your daughter's not in school?" It's like, we are in school. This is homeschool. She's learning here right now. And here's the tax percentage on this particular item. This is what I'm going to have to pay in tax. It's like these people who are just plugged into this mantra of have to go to public school and sit in a row and learn like everybody else did. Big paradigm shift. You don't have to do that. Learning happens on multiple levels in multiple ways. So homeschool, big time on the rise. National Homeschool Conventions, National Homeschool Association, you can contact them. And by the way, if you do perceive that you want to continue homeschooling, I strongly, strongly recommend you get involved in HSLDA, the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. For like $120 a year, I think is the annual fee, you pay into this pool. And if for some reason Child Protective Services or somebody says you're not teaching your student correctly, whatever, and someone comes knocking on your door, all you got to do is pick up your phone while you're standing right there at the door, call the HSLDA, the Homeschool Legal Defense, and say, it's okay. Yeah, CPS is right here, and here, talk to CPS. And it's like, here, talk to my lawyer. It's that easy. We never had that happen, but some parents have. And for $120 a year, they will defend you for whatever comes against you. Some people have been told that they have to, in their state, file certain paperwork, and the law says you don't have to file that paperwork. But a school district might say, you have to, yes, you have to. And they start pressing charges against the family. Hey, HSLDA gets in there and says, no, state law says this. And then the school district backs down. pays for it right there. Anyways, homeschool, do that. Last story. Let's talk about Mr. Anthony Fauci. Ah, yes, the guy who has a difficult time keeping his facts straight. And I recently saw that there's a book, a children's book about Anthony Fauci coming out. And my comment when I posted the cover of the book, I said, I'm wondering if every fifth page contradicts the previous four. But just a side joke. Sorry, Anthony Fauci. John Hopkins, doctor, declares that we are close to COVID herd immunity. Mr. Fauci really believes that we're only going to get herd immunity if everybody, like 80 to 90% of the population, gets vaccinated. Since this whole COVID thing started, Anthony Fauci has been anti-everything except vaccines and masks. He has been remdesivir, whatever that drug was that he had a part in. That was $3,000 a dose that actually ended up making things worse, but he was touting that because he was financially connected to it. All these natural things like vitamin D, which they discovered in Europe, that if you have adequate levels of vitamin D, 30 milligrams per deciliter, I believe is the number. Basically, if you take 6,000 international units of vitamin D every day, you're fine. A doctor here in Idaho did a presentation. It's had almost 200,000 views already on YouTube. He says, we don't have a cold and flu season. We have a low vitamin D season. He says, when the sun goes down during the wintertime and it's so low on the horizon and we don't get enough of an angle of the sun, you can't get vitamin D. He says, you could be out in a tutu on a sunny day in the winter and you're not going to get an ounce, not a bit of vitamin D into your skin. You need to be supplementing vitamin D in the fall through the spring, because and I mean through the spring. Summertime is when you get your vitamin D through the skin. But even then, why stop? Just supplement with vitamin D. Why? Because they're finding in Europe that if you have adequate vitamin D levels, you are much, much less likely to catch COVID. And if you do catch COVID, you are much more likely to have very limited symptoms. So very easy symptoms. People that I've talked to that have had COVID describe it as having a cold. Some of them describe it. My mother-in-law had it. She said, I felt I was weak for a couple of weeks. It was like any other kind of cold and flu that I had for about 3 or 4 days, and then I was weak for a couple of weeks. How did she know she had it? Because she lost her sense of smell and her sense of taste when she got that cold. She's in her mid-70s. She was up on her vitamin D. She was fine. She had very light symptoms. She felt weak for a couple of weeks. That was it. Her brother also caught COVID. And he's got more comorbidity factors. So he was a little bit worse. He had it a little bit worse, but he still got over it. Why? Vitamin D. His doctor finally had a brain engaged and said, here, take this vitamin D, take this zinc, take this quercetin, take all this stuff here. All the stuff that Dr. Zelenko was talking about over a year ago that Anthony Fauci poo-pooed. These people in their 70s who are getting COVID, who are just doing fine with it if they do this natural stuff that Anthony Fauci said, no, I can't have it. So here's Dr. Marty Makary of Johns Hopkins, has been one of the lone medical professionals trying to bring reason and logic to the COVID pandemic. By the way, it's not a pandemic. He lobbed a grenade into the tent by declaring that we'll all have herd immunity by April. That's right. This is Dr. Marty Makary of Johns Hopkins says that the country will have herd immunity by April. Of course, this is heavily disputed by the those living under the authoritarian yoke of the lab coats. He says about 1 in 600 Americans has died of COVID, which translates to a population fatality rate of about 0.15%. By that count, he estimates that 2/3 of the country has already had the virus. The survival rate is, like I said, 99% plus. with natural immunity, we are going to do fine. And you take the vaccinations, which, by the way, by definition of a vaccine, it is not. It does not do what the CDC's definition of a vaccine is. It does not do that. It does something different to our bodies, and it's permanent, and you can't change it. Once you get this injection that they're calling a vaccine, you cannot change what it does to your body, and it changes how your body responds to spike proteins, which are on viruses. I digress. So Texas took out the mask mandates. You cannot have mask mandates in Texas. Anthony Fauci said, oh my gosh, Texas is going to spike with COVID cases. Fear, the sky is falling, Chicken Little, blah, blah, blah. Guess what? 3 weeks later, cases are dropping. In fact, cases dropped 77% in Texas, Mr. Fauci, and they're still dropping. I think you've been wrong about a lot of things. So Makary says that he went after the expert class, which is the Fauci class, and they follow the science narrative. He says they themselves have not followed the science. I do happen to know, and I have a copy, and maybe I'll post it someday again. Picture of the email. I just grabbed a screenshot of it when somebody was showing it, but here's an email of Anthony Fauci being asked, how much vitamin D do you take, Anthony Fauci? 6,000 international units every day. How come, since he's doing that, he's not recommending that everybody else take it? Great question. Glad you asked. Dr. Mark Makary says that these people are more paralyzed by fear with their contradictory and utterly useless COVID protocols, especially when it comes to the vaccine. He says if you get the vaccine, you still have to remain in a state of panic, because you have to keep wearing your mask even after you're vaccinated because of variants. Viruses are going to mutate no matter what. So if you really had a vaccine, you wouldn't need a mask and you wouldn't need to worry about variants, because your body would be trained to handle that chain, that branch of infection. T cells, natural killer cells, that kind of stuff. I've done a previous podcast on this. In fact, my last podcast, I believe March, I forget which one it was. I don't want to steer you wrong. But what I do want to do is steer you to my interview with Anthony Fauci. I did this interview back in January of this year, so a couple months ago. And it quickly became my most viewed podcast. So you can go to the New Book of Daniel on YouTube, or you can go to uncoverdc.com, look up the New Book of Daniel podcast, and you will find my interview with Dr. Vladimir Zelenko. Someone somewhere linked to that article, to that podcast in the past week, and they linked to it at the Uncover DC site. Because we just had our staff meeting this morning, and I was told that the article, that the podcast was rated number 1 this past week as the most visited thing on the site. The most visited page on the site was that podcast. So hey, I think people are starting to wake up to the fact that this is a bunch of malarkey, that this is a bunch of smoke and mirrors, and Dr. Zelenko tells us exactly what to do for prophylaxis, so that you don't catch COVID to begin with. Your chances, I should say, greatly reduced, I shouldn't say don't catch, but greatly reduced of catching COVID. And if you do catch it, what to do to make sure that you don't end up in the hospital, because that's the last place you want to be if you catch COVID. Do not go there. Make sure you read up on Dr. Zelenko's recommended protocols. He's got them listed for free on his site. Dr. Makary says that herd immunity is very close, even if Fauci does not want to acknowledge it. So with that, I'm going to wrap up the show. I thank you very much for listening. This has been the New Book of Daniel podcast. My name is Daniel Bobinski. If you want to subscribe to the show, If you're watching this on YouTube, just click the little subscribe button. If you're watching it on another video platform, hit the subscribe button, please. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. And if you're on YouTube, you want to click that little bell. You'll get notified then when we go live, when we upload new shows. And I still have to edit down a couple of new shows. Interview with Dr. Stella Emanuel from Frontline Doctors, and another one that I did this past week that I just haven't had time to edit and add all the B-roll footage to, but you'll enjoy that. And of course, if you want to read my stuff, you can go to uncoverdc.com. If you want to follow me on social media, just look on all the platforms for New Book of Daniel. CloutHub, MeWe, Gab, Facebook. I am not on Twitter, but just look up New Book of Daniel, and you can track me there, send me some questions. And of course, if you want to go ahead and get one of these fancy New Book of Daniel coffee mugs, couple of bucks to help the podcast out, and you can show off to your friends, and you can have your very own New Book of Daniel coffee mug. So with that, I'm going to say thank you again for listening. Have yourself a great week or day or whatever it is you're at right now. I will catch you on the next show. Until next time, be blessed.